coach. He is going to basically tell us how to live longer and have a good summary.
That's absolutely the nub of the presentation. Yeah.
The presentation is going to be we're recording. A couple of people couldn't be here, so they can share within the company. So I'll hand over to Nick so he can give you background of who he is and what he does. And we'll go through the presentation, and I'm sure if you have questions, we'll be more than happy to answer them.
Friday afternoon. This should be very relaxed and quite humorous. Some of what I'm going to say is quite controversial and goes against conventional wisdom. So please, if you have any questions, make a note of them or some notes in your phone, and we'll save them to the end, because you actually get more out of asking me questions than you are out of a presentation, because whenever you do a presentation, you've got to kind of do it generically for a wide audience, and some people like the science and want more science, and some people don't like science and just want to get the top bullet points. We're going to start with... Yep. Okay. No. Well, that's actually a good cue, because the presentation starts with a photograph. Okay, so that was me, unrecognizable me, 3 years ago. 118 kilos. Thanks. Changed a little. I've lost 40 kilos since then. So, who is Nick Eggleton and why am I here? So I'm a marketing professional. I've been working in marketing for 30 plus years. I've been running my own marketing agency for the last 15 of the last 17 years in the UK and here. During that time, I've had lots of lunches, client dinners, and sedentary knowledge-based work, so sitting at a computer for 8 hours a day mainly. So that's how I got into that state. At 52, I was 118 kilos, pre-diabetic, snoring, grumpy, and was using alcohol as a kind of comfort blanket. The outlook was, well, the health trajectory would be type 2 diabetes, dementia, cardiovascular disease, maybe some form of cancer. I didn't like the idea of that. So I went down a bit of a rabbit hole from a lifestyle point of view and decided to change a few things. Lost that 40 kilos as a consequence. But in the meantime, I've made myself type 2 diabetes proof, hopefully dementia proof, probably cardiovascular, healthy, lowered the risks at least of those kind of diseases. The reason why I'm here is because I'm angry at marketing professionals in big pharma, big food, big agriculture who have brainwashed society into believing a number of myths about nutrition and science around nutrition, and they've caused a lot of public health problems, and public health is in crisis. And it's people who work in marketing who use the techniques of propaganda to get us into that position. So this is my atonement. It started off with being concerned. So once I learned what I learned, I was concerned for my family, my daughters, my wife, even my ex-wife. And I wanted to share that information that I'd learned. I wrote a 7,000-word blog on the subject. And every time somebody said to me, well, I lost 10 kilos or 15 kilos, well, you look like you've lost weight. How did you do that? And I'd stand there and bore them for 40 minutes. And in the end, I thought, well, I better write this down. I can just point them, send them a link, and they can read it in their own free time. So because I work in marketing, my skill set is in behavior change. My job is to nudge my clients' audiences and target audiences to buy their products and services. So those skills are kind of transferable to what I'm doing now, which is coaching. So my job isn't to educate, although that's what I'm doing here. I'm not actually coaching. But it's to try and help people build habits that can take them on a different health trajectory using nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle modification. I certified as a coach with the Primal Health Coaching Institute. It's a health coaching institute that was formed by a guy called Mark Sisson, who wrote the Primal Blueprint, has a blog called Mark's Daily Apple, developed a product range called Primal Kitchen that he sold to Kraft for tens of millions of dollars. He's well-known godfather of the paleo movement. Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Yeah, try again. And the Primal Health Coaching Institute teaches an evolutionary approach to nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle to optimize the genetic expression to live a longer, healthier life. It's back to your cue, longer, healthier life. Okay. So that's who I am and why I'm here. And what we're going to talk about today is live long and prosper. Did I do it right? I think I did. You all remember that. So then the retort back from Spock is peace and long life, just in case you didn't know. Google did. Okay, so presentation contents. We're going to talk about inflammation, cognitive function, the stress cycle of inflammation, metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance, modern environmental disease epidemic, managing inflammation, what's pro-inflammatory, what's anti-inflammatory. I'm going to summarize all that, and then you can ask me some questions. The full presentation did include a 15-minute presentation on evolutionary biology, genetics and epigenetics. Oh, it's a Friday afternoon. And I wanted to get straight to the what should you be eating, what shouldn't you be eating part of the presentation. But I'm going to build up to that gradually. Inflammation. Everybody's heard the word. There are two types of inflammation, acute and chronic. And inflammation affects the body and the brain. So if you've got inflammation in the body, you're going to have inflammation in the brain. Acute is a reaction to trauma, burns, cuts, infections. And chronic inflammation results in cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, a whole host of diseases that come from chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation can start in the gut, can travel through the vagus nerve, through the blood-brain barrier and into the brain. So it's a whole system thing. So acute inflammation, you get a scratch or a bump, and you get a little localized reaction to it. Chronic inflammation that comes into your body and is as a result of your body not dealing with the acute inflammatory response, the immune response, can actually affect the whole body. We're here to talk about mind, particularly because we're in the knowledge game, and it's very important to have good mental acuity. And I'm going to talk about two specific parts of the brain. I'm going to talk about the limbic system, which is the amygdala and the hippocampus. And I'm going to talk about the neocortex, or the prefrontal cortex, which is at the front of our brains. It's the difference between the amygdala is what's often called the reptilian brain, and the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, is the mammalian brain. It's the thing that we developed that makes us the apex species. So the cerebral cortex, which contains the prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for our executive function. That's where we do our adulting, where we pilot. If anybody's read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, he talks about System 1, System 2, pilot, autopilot. Well, this is where the pilot sits. And this is where we have compassion and empathy, and we look forward. We visualize actions and consequences to those actions. It's where we plan, where we have our willpower centered, where we present our focus. So it's really important in the knowledge game that we have this really good, really well-working prefrontal cortex. The limbic system. The limbic system is the child. That's the autopilot, the reactive part of the brain, the system 1 part. The amygdala is responsible for fight or flight, so it sees threats. So it's a threat response part of the brain. And the hippocampus is memory, so it basically remembers what's threatening, what's not threatening. And it relies on dopamine and endorphins as neurotransmitters in order to function, and it requires those things. It seeks out dopamine, and it's responsible for the emotion and reactive threat response. It's where we get where the anxiety sits, where our impulsivity sits, and where our reward structure sits. So it's what is very developed in addicts. So if we look at a normal brain where the limbic system is communicating with the prefrontal cortex, there's a two-way street. So we see things and we react and judge and we take everything in balance. It's only when we become inflamed that these two areas stop speaking to each other and we become overwhelmingly limbically driven. So it's almost like this seesaw where the adult is now overwhelmed by the child. So when we're inflamed, we become less executive, should I say. So inflammation makes us emotional and reactive, insecure, anxious, impulsive, narcissistic, and unfocused. That's not a nice thing, not a nice place to be, is it? Nobody wants to be in that place. But that's what inflammation does. And if it's acute and it's temporary, and we deal with it and we move on, it's when it becomes chronic and it's there all the time, it's systemic, that it becomes a problem and we get into a little bit of a stress cycle. So we've got this chronic inflammation, this chronic stress, and that leads us to poor decision making. It leads us to anxiety and depression and narcissism. And those things need feeding. So they get fed by the desire for dopamine, the quick fix, the instant gratification. That's the child wanting reward. Okay? So that leads to chronic use of short-term fixes, sugar, alcohol, gambling, risk, cake, lollies, porn, whatever it might be, which leads to chronic stress, chronic inflammation, and chronic illness. Sad face. There's been colour in my PowerPoint. The number one cause of chronic inflammation, I'm going to talk briefly about, is insulin resistance. This is kind of sciencey, this is a bit nutrition-y. So what is metabolic syndrome? Metabolic syndrome used to be called syndrome X, and it's what doctors will diagnose, give people a diagnosis, if they meet any of these three criteria. So if you've got high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high triglycerides, low LDL, and you're obese, or you've got three of those things, you're classed as having metabolic syndrome. I put obesity optional because there are genetic phenotypes of people that don't get obese but get metabolic syndrome. So they're thin on the outside, fat on the inside. So they've got a lot of adipose tissue, they've got fat around the liver, and around the heart, and around the pancreas. So that's what we call toffee. Metabolic disease is insulin resistance. Insulin resistance leads to chronic inflammation. Type 2 diabetes can lead to dementia. They're saying that dementia, Alzheimer's, is now an insulin resistance of the brain. And cardio and cerebrovascular diseases and autoimmune diseases. So what is insulin resistance? In simple terms, we are wired to eat fatty, sugary food. We're wired for hundreds of thousands of years. We're wired as babies. When we're born, we are in a state of ketosis. In order to feed the brain and to feed the body, the babies suckle on breast milk, which is 50-50 fat and carbs, fat and sugar. So it's no surprise that we love donuts because they are 50-50 fat and sugar. It's no surprise that we love macadamia nuts because they are 50-50 fat and sugar. Anywhere we get fries or donuts where we've got 50-50 fat and sugar, chips, crisps, we're wired to eat that stuff. It's like it's just evolutionarily programmed. The problem is sugar and carbs. Sugar, which are carbohydrates, they're the same thing, they're interchangeable. They burn 6 times quicker than fat. So if we eat them simultaneously, like donuts and fries, our body processes the sugar first, and it stores the fat. So it has to burn the sugar. This is really, it's like when you have a barbecue and you put tinder on the barbecue to get the fire going. You put maybe rolled up newspapers, you light a match, it goes, and then it goes, that's what sugar does. Whereas the fat is slow burning, that's the charcoal that you put on the barbecue. So you use the carbs and then you change you use the carbs and change to the fat, or you use the tinder and then you change to the coke. So glucose is preferred, fat is stored. Any unused glucose, and bearing in mind that the bloodstream only has about 5 grams, an adult only has about 5 grams, a teaspoon of sugar in their blood at any one time. So if you have more than 5 grams of sugar, a teaspoon of sugar, that blood's got to be used or it needs to be stored somewhere. And what happens is the unused glucose fills glycogen stores. Glycogen is stored in the muscles and the liver. We store about 650 grams of glucose as glycogen, which is about 2,500, 3,000 calories of energy in sugar in our muscles and our liver, so that we can call upon that. So when we've burnt through that 5 grams, our cells are using that energy, then we can call on our liver to replace that sugar in the bloodstream. But when the glycogen stores are full, so when we've got full muscles, full liver of glycogen, we've still got glucose in our system. We can't have it in our blood because we'll get blood poisoning, we'll get hyperglycemia. So the liver converts the glucose to triglycerides. Triglycerides are basically a fat, and they're stored in adipose tissue. And that is subcutaneous initially and visceral around the organs eventually. So insulin resistance occurs once the fat threshold has been reached. Now, everybody has a different fat threshold. Some people can be obese and not have insulin resistance because they haven't met their threshold, whereas some people can get insulin resistance without getting obese, which I mentioned earlier. So this is when the body can no longer use the insulin to force glucose in the cell. So the cells become resistant to glucose, insulin resistant. I'm not going to go into what insulin is. It's a master hormone that communicates with the liver, communicates with the cells, and then pushes glucose into the cells to be used by the mitochondria. It's very sciencey. But you just take it as it's called, insulin resistance, and it's really important. Now what happens when the fat's in the cells is they become inflammatory, and they release adipokines, which are adipo from the fat, and kines meaning immune, it's part of the immune system. So that's where we get inflammation. So this poor glucose tolerance leads to inflammation. So too much sugar in the system leads to inflammation. That's where we get this chronic inflammation from having too much carbs. And the consequence of that to public health is these modern environmental diseases. And these are the 7 leading causes of death in Australia. And you can see that coronary heart disease is up there, as is Alzheimer's and dementia. That wasn't always so. The commonest causes in our grandparents' time was people who would die in bed, or they'd die of pneumonia, or they'd die of tuberculosis, or cholera, or rickets, or some communicable disease. Now, the most diseases that people die from are non-communicable, until coronavirus gets. Okay. Chronic inflammation is also can result in autoimmune issues. Autoimmune issues are when the body starts to see itself as an alien pathogen within the system. There's a much longer presentation, but all of these diseases are autoimmune, and they all are related to insulin resistance, to inflammation. And even if you haven't got a disease, there are lots of other common metabolic symptoms of chronic inflammation. So you can see chronic inflammation is a public health disaster waiting to happen. You know, in America they spend $3 trillion on their healthcare system, and $1 trillion of those dollars are spent on metabolic diseases, type 2 diabetes, etc. So how do we manage inflammation and therefore cognitive performance and therefore long-term health? We need to remove what is pro-inflammatory, the things that make us inflamed. And I'm going to start with the baddest boy in the land. Industrial seed oils. It's not booze. Now, during that 40, just as an aside, I've drank gin every day for the last 3 years, so I'm not anti-alcohol, right? You just pick your poison. This stuff is the poison. So in 1977, John McGovern, who was a senator in America and in charge of the US agriculture department. He was on a committee that came up with the idea, or rubber stamped the idea that scientists had at the time, that saturated fat was bad, it caused high cholesterol caused heart disease, we need to shut it down. Sponsored by the sugar industry, they said low fat, high carb is how we will create our guidelines. Today in America, 70% of calories come from refined, ultra-processed foods, which include refined grains, refined oils. So when they reduced saturated fat, people needed to cook in something, and they started to cook more in this stuff: seed oils, canola oil, safflower oil, sunflower oils, corn oil, cottonseed oil. This stuff was invented in the middle of the 1800s. It was used as a lubricant on machines as a byproduct of the cotton industry. They realized that if they treated it in a chemical way, they dissolved it, they colorized it, they deodorized it, they could make a lubricant that they could burn in lamps, because whale oil was quite expensive. Some bright spark realized that if they hydrogenated it in a chemical process, it would solidify it, and they could then use it to cut lard, and they could feed it to animals. The animals didn't die immediately, so they thought, well, maybe it's safe for humans. So then they started putting it in bottles and selling it to us as margarine, and we started eating it. But we ate it only in small amounts, and only people in the really poor would eat margarine rather than butter, until the 1970s, when we had this, well, we can't eat butter anymore, we can't eat lard or tallow anymore, we've got to eat vegetable oil and margarine. So this stuff is a polyunsaturated fatty acid that is unstable in the presence of oxygen and heat. And what do we do with it? We cook with it at high temperatures. It converts it into aldehydes, into acrylins, into a number of different disgusting and toxic substances that cause a cascade of reactive oxygen species within our cells, within our mitochondria. So, and we store it in our adipose tissue too. So that's where the inflammation comes from, storing this muck. So if there's one thing that you take away today, one thing, it's to take the seed oil in the house and throw it in the garbage. And when you go into a restaurant, ask, what are you frying my stuff in? And if it's vegetable oil, ask for it to be fried in butter. And if they can't fry it in butter, don't order the fried food. This stuff, if you have a portion of chips fried in this stuff, it has the same acrylin as smoking 20 cigarettes. It is cytotoxic, mutagenic, it affects your DNA. It's ridiculously bad. The only reason we're still on the shelves and buying this stuff is because in 1917, when the FDA was invented, 1915, 1919, this stuff was already on the marketplace as Crisco, made by Procter & Gamble. And Procter & Gamble lobbied the FDA and said, this is generally regarded as safe, and therefore it's protected. So it was grandfathered, like a lot of other things. So that's why it's on the shelves. It's not safe. It is horrendously toxic. It's not the same as olive oil and avocado oil and macadamia nut oil. They are fruit oils. They are actually squeezed from fruit. They require no processing. This stuff is dissolved in hexane, it's deodorized and it's bleached, and it's got lots of preservatives in it. I'm going to move on. I hate this stuff. Right. Second villain in the room. Grains. So grains like wheat, rice, corn, the big three, to a certain extent soy, have lectins in them. And lectins are the plant's defense mechanism. So plants can't run away from predators, so they protect their seeds with toxins to put off being eaten by insects or mammals or mold. And we humans are above nature, so we can obviously eat plenty of toxins without any effect. At the top end of the scale, there's an autoimmune response to wheat that you'll have heard of, celiac disease, which is basically the body going into an anaphylactic autoimmune response to the presence of this lectin. The wheat germ agglutinin lectin, specifically, which agglutinates blood, which glues the blood together. But wheat germ agglutinin and lectins are only one of the chemicals, one of the anti-nutrients in plants. So if you're not eating the baby plant, the seed, then you're probably safe. So green leafy vegetables, they're not seeds. If you're eating squash and you're not eating the seeds in a squash or a pumpkin, you're probably safe. A tuber is not a seed, so you could be okay with the tubers. But seeds and legumes, which are the seeds, so peas and beans and peanuts, they're also seeds of plants, and they have a lot of anti-nutrients in them, so they can be, you can be very sensitive to them. According to a guy called Fasano, who's at Harvard, he reckons that although 8% of the population are celiac, 23% have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, the rest of us just have a better tolerance to it. And one of the things that wheat particularly does is it promotes leaky gut. It promotes intestinal permeability. There's a protein inside it called gliadin, which accelerates zonulin, which is part of our system, which opens the gaps in our gut, the tight junctions in our gut, and allows food, undigested food, and fecal matter and bacteria into our bloodstream. So when you hear about leaky gut, intestinal permeability, the number one cause of that is an intolerance to wheat. All right. Okay. I didn't talk as long about wheat and rice as I did about vegetable oil, because this stuff we've been eating for 12,000 years. The oils we've only been eating for 100, and in the quantities we are for the last 20 or 30. So that's why oil's at the top of the list. The next big villain is sugar, added sugar, refined sugar. Sugar's in everything. It's hidden in sauces and dressings and pretty much everything, in bread. You know, there's about 4 teaspoons of sugar in 2 slices of white bread. Not all bread is equal. If you make your own sourdough, yeah, that's different from going buying a shop loaf of white sliced. There's all sorts of stuff. The reason why they're able to sell white sliced at the price that they are is because they can make it in an hour, whereas your sourdough's got approved for 24, 36, 48 hours. While that's going through the proving process, it breaks down the gluten. So a sourdough loaf is 90% gluten-free, whereas your loaf that's not gone through that process is 100% gluten-ready. Going back to sugar, everything on there has got sugar in it. Jam, apart from the butter. Jam, the bread, the orange juice, the cakes, the fruit, the latte. The worst way to take sugar is in a drink, because it hits your system quickly. And again, if you're taking all that glucose in and your glycogen stores are full, you're just going to convert it into fat, and it's going to become inflammatory. What else do I want to say? Yeah, fructose. So orange juice contains fructose. So there's 2 types of sugar, glucose and fructose. So table sugar that you spoon onto your Wheaties, that's sucrose, which is 50-50 fructose and glucose. And all that stuff about glucose and glycogen I talked about earlier is, as a carbohydrate, is metabolized in the body in a different way to fructose. Fructose is actually seen by the body almost in the same way that it sees alcohol. It's a sugar alcohol. It has to be metabolized in the liver and treated as a toxin. If it can't be treated, the liver stores it as fat. So that's how you get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So when they take kids off their soda drinks to improve their type 2 diabetes, the first thing that happens is they lose the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, because the fat gets used as energy, but it's not actually converted into the cells. Our mitochondria in our cells can't use fructose. They can only use glucose. So ditch the sugar if you want to ditch the pro-inflammatory stuff. There's a number of other things I could have gone into on all of these things in terms of what's pro-inflammatory. Sleep deprivation, nutrient deficiency, and you can see there's a whole heap of environmental stuff that's inflammatory. And my job is to coach my clients and you as people who are listening to me in the audience into just being aware that our bodies have pathways to deal with toxins. Our liver's great. We can sweat. But when we have all of these things piling up, we get to a point where we've got toxic overload. And Nick Heaton was really happy that I put air pollution on here when I spoke to him, Andrew. But everything on there can be inflammatory. That's the end of the pro-inflammatory story. So now the good news, what's anti-inflammatory? Omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids from fish and from eggs and from offal. Yeah, so I saw a grimace there. Yeah, you're not going to like the next slide. So cold water fatty fish, that's sardines, mackerel, anchovies, herring and salmon. Those are the top smallish cold water fatty fish, and they're very, very good for you as far as being anti-inflammatory. Offal, kidneys, heart, liver, brains, really, really nutrient dense. More nutrient dense than muscle meat. When wolves and lions capture prey, the head lion, the head wolf, go straight for the guts. They go straight for the heart and the liver. And we as humans, as we evolved, we watched how the carnivores ate, and we imitated them as apes 2 million years ago, and we're like, okay, that's the good stuff.
Is there very high cholesterol now?
No, there's no, well, the kidneys would be surrounded by fat, so if you don't eat the fat that's surrounding the kidneys, you're not going to ingest cholesterol. I can talk about cholesterol in a big detail, but cholesterol is not a villain. Okay, cholesterol is not a villain. You know, cholesterol is, that's one thing you take away outside of this presentation. I can talk about for hours. Cholesterol is not a villain. I'll come back to cholesterol. But yeah, there is cholesterol in the fat, but you don't have to eat the fat. There's a little bit of fat on those hearts. Okay. And eggs. Now, even if you don't like fish and you don't like offal, everybody loves an egg. Don't fear the egg. The egg yolk has all of the nutrients to support the life of a baby chicken. It's so nutrient dense. It's full of vitamins and minerals and good fats and protein. And it's full of polyunsaturated fatty omega-3, full of DHA and EPA, which are good for your brain, as well as B12 and choline and K2. It's just, the eggs are awesome. And you cannot eat too many eggs, even though they're full of cholesterol. And getting 8 hours sleep. So I'm just going to the one thing on this list of many things that I'd just like you to consider. The shorter you sleep, the shorter your life. There's a book called Why We Sleep by a guy called Matthew Walker, which is an absolute seminal piece of work on the health aspects of sleep. And we as a society are not getting enough sleep. We're denying our nature and the circadian rhythm of going to bed 2 hours after dusk and waking up at dawn. And that obviously changes throughout the year, through summer and winter. But because we deny that, we use blue light to keep ourselves awake, and we use coffee and we use other stimulants. We've shortened that 8 hours, where we used to sleep in Victorian times and for thousands of years, tens and hundreds of thousands of years before. And we're now in America, I think the average is 6.45, and in Japan it's 6.35 hours of sleep. So I go to bed religiously at around about 9 o'clock, 9:15, read a book half an hour out, and then I wake up and get up when it's light. I get about 8 hours total sleep. So to summarize, it's not bad, is it? To break the stress cycle, eat anti-inflammatory foods, so organic wild meat and fish, some plants, low glycemic index fruit. So low glycemic index fruit are berries, so blackberries, blueberries, strawberries, raspberries. They've got very little sugar in them. Eat healthy saturated and monounsaturated fat. And I would put polyunsaturated fats on there, but I don't want to confuse people because there are unhealthy polyunsaturated fats. Dump the pro-inflammatory stuff, so no sugar, no grains, no vegetable oil, no ultra-processed foods. Also, if you've got sensitivity to dairy and eggs, it's quite common, and you might not even be aware of it. They can be pro-inflammatory, as are nightshades to certain people who have sensitivities to tomatoes and potatoes and other members of the nightshade family. You think about it, nightshades if your ethnicity is Northern European, where your descendants come from, you've only been eating nightshades for 400 or 500 years, because that's when we discovered South America and started importing them into Europe. And then if you're of Indian origin or Southeastern Asia, you weren't eating tomatoes and potatoes for another couple of hundred years until the Brits brought them there. So we have to think about our ancestry when we're thinking about what's good for us from an evolutionary point of view. FODMAP are foods that are contained within those, and it's an acronym for a really long word that I can't say, but ends in saccharides. And it's basically things like peppers, but also things like some potatoes, onions and garlic as well. So anti-nutrients I talked about lectins. I didn't talk about the others, prolamins, agglutinins, oxalates, phytates, saponins, glycoalkaloids and digestive enzyme inhibitors, and that's just a tip of the iceberg. Those are just the most toxic. But, just out of interest, when the Peruvians used to eat potatoes, it used to go through a 2-day processing and fermentation, and they used to eat it with clay to make sure that the glycoalkaloids that were in the potato were actually bound to the clay so that they didn't get the poison from the potato. When was the last time you fermented a potato for 2 days and ate it with clay? We don't do that. We've bred the potato, outbred the glycoalkaloids, but they're still there, which is why some people have a reaction to them. Oxalates and phytates, they're common in vegetables and they bind to minerals. So when people say there's calcium or iron in a vegetable, and you're eating that and you think you're getting that iron or calcium, it's actually bound to the phytate, it goes straight through the gut and out the other end. Any industrially raised whole food, that's a new word. Although I eat meat, and quite a lot of meat, I only eat wild-caught, pasture-raised, organic, grass-fed. I don't eat farmed salmon. I don't eat farmed beef or pork or anything else. I just think from a health point of view and then from an environmental point of view, never mind the ethics of how that's manufacturing process, it's the same for any food. Monocropping with soy and wheat and rice and corn, they're exactly the same. They strip the soil, they release carbon into the atmosphere, so they're not good for the planet. So industrialized food, buy from farmers markets, buy from your local butchers, buy local produce, buy stuff that you know where it's grown. Don't be buying asparagus flown in from Mexico. What else? Supplement deficiencies. So people who don't eat enough meat particularly are deficient in vitamins A, B12, D, E and K. A, D, E and K are fat-soluble vitamins. B12 is water-soluble. Very often omega-3, particularly DHA and EPA, so you can buy supplements for those things. Because our soil has been depleted of nutrients, and the soil quality here in Australia isn't necessarily as good as other places in the world because it was a seabed till recently. So magnesium, potassium and sodium, the electrolytes, are very low in our soil as it is, and every time we grow a harvest of crop, we deplete it more. The World Health Organization has estimated that in America, some parts of America, they've only got 60 harvests left because the soil is that depleted. To actually fertilize the soil these days, they have to use agrochemicals from big agrochemical companies to actually put nitrogen back into the soil because even the nitrogen's been depleted. So breaking the stress cycle, exercise is good, resistance exercise and slow cardio, not chronic cardio. So don't be going to Zumba 3 times a week and body pump and running marathons. It's not good for your joints and it's not good for your heart and it's not good for your cortisol. And when you've got high levels of cortisol, you're going to have low levels of testosterone. When you've got high levels of cortisol, you're going to have low levels of glucagon, which is glucagon is the hormone that activates lipolysis. So if you're chronically stressed, your body thinks, hang on a second, there's a famine coming, I better keep hold of this fat store. So if you've got lots of stress, you're going to hold on to that. You need to de-stress to lose weight. Repair the gut, so that gut permeability in the microbiome, so that's really important. And become insulin sensitive through a more ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting. Detox your life digitally, environmentally and psychologically, and get into nature, more sunlight and more grounding. Get your bare feet on grass or sand and get some vitamin D. And sleep more. So lower stimulants, blue light and coffee, which stimulate the brain, so that stops the activation of melatonin, which you need to activate to get into sleep. And create a sleep sanctuary, so cool, dark, quiet, and EMF free. And if you need to, meditate or write in a journal, again, as another way of reducing stress. That is the end of my presentation. Okay, so live a longer, healthier life. Support your genes through reducing and removing inflammation. Who has the first question? Cholesterol. Do you want to talk about cholesterol?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So every cell in our body is surrounded by a membrane that is 80% cholesterol. Our brains are full of cholesterol. Cholesterol is the precursor for all of our sex hormones. Vitamin D is basically created in our bodies by converting cholesterol in our subcutaneous fat from the UVB rays of the sun. So ultraviolet light converts cholesterol into vitamin D, which isn't a vitamin, it's actually a hormone. It's got a bad name. So cholesterol is really, really important to our bodies for us to function healthily and optimally. The reason why it's got a bad rap is because in 1954, Dwight D. Eisenhower had a heart attack. He was the American president at the time, smoked 40 cigarettes a day. He asked his doctors. One doctor said, I think it's saturated fat because these Russians cut open some heart attack victims and they found this cholesterol deposit. So maybe it's the cholesterol that's causing the heart attack, not the fact that he smoked 40 cigarettes a day and had them for 50, 60 years. So they basically said, well, it's probably the cholesterol. And then this guy called Ansel Keys went out to look for proof. And he did a survey of about 20-odd countries around the world and looked for where they had high heart disease and low heart disease. And there was a pattern of about 7 countries that had low incidence of heart disease and a kind of similar diet that didn't appear to be very high in fat, saturated fat. So the 7-nation study then became proof, and cherry-picked these 7 countries out of the 21, that low cholesterol diet was better for heart disease. So there was a correlation, but he actually cherry-picked it. It's that's the nature of epidemiology. And so that's what influenced the McGovern report in 1977. That whole train started rolling on from the 1950s. Ansel Keys wasn't a nutritionist, he was a marine biologist. He was only asked by the president because he'd invented K rations during the Second World War and done some studies on populations and starvation and how we were going to refeed Europe after World War II. So cholesterol is necessary. Cholesterol is found in the artery at the scene of a heart attack event, but it's there like in the same way that an ambulance is at an RTA. So there's a road traffic accident, the ambulance arrives, tries to make things better, and then we point at the ambulance and say, "Ah, you caused the accident." That's why cholesterol is in those fatty deposits. So it's not the cholesterol what did it, it's inflammation what did it.
Well, that's good, I like eggs. But I thought it was not good. There's too much cholesterol.
Okay.
What
No.
do you do?
More eggs. More eggs. You can't eat too many eggs.
Not eat your eggs.
Can I ask you to pass the cards around? So if anybody wants to take a card and ask me a question, because sometimes people have private questions that they don't want to ask in public, and they might want to ask me via email. So if you take a card, you can ask me via email and answer your questions.
What did you do to lose your 40 kilos, and what are you doing to keep it off?
The same thing.
Gin.
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 Every day. Why gin?
Gin has got 0 carbohydrates in it. It is an alcohol. And I drink it with soda water, so I'm not drinking either a diet or a sugared soda. So it's because it's got no carbohydrates in it, it's quite low calorie, and it's the least worst poison. Wine's not so bad, but it's got a bit of fructose in it, a bit of sugar. Beer, particularly not gluten-free beer, has got gluten in it. It's quite it's got quite a lot of carbohydrates in it. So don't drink beer anymore. I slowed down on the wine a bit. I used to drink a bottle of wine a night. That's how I got to that picture. And now I don't. I drink maybe three gin and sodas. And they're large gins though, like they're 50 ml shots. When I make a Negroni, it's 50 mils of gin, 50 mils of vermouth, and 50 mils of Campari. I'm trying to picture my shelf in the pantry because it's at the back now because I hardly ever touch it. No, I don't have three. I don't have 3 Negronis, but I have 3 large gin and sodas. Yeah. What did I do? First of all, I cut out grains, and then I cut down on the other refined carbs. So I used to cook. I loved cooking. I used to make risotto and pasta and pizza. I just had to say no to all that stuff. But the real step change was the intermittent fasting. So I read a book called Fast Diet by Michael Mosley, 5'2". His publishers have kind of elbowed him to write another book called Fast 800. It's just the same stuff repackaged. Intermittent fasting, what that does is it depletes your glycogen stores and it promotes ketones, so you get into a more ketogenic state, and so your body becomes less reliant on eating, and your body basically lets those fat cells, the triglycerides, break apart into short-chain fatty acids and glucose, and you basically burn your own fat stores. So it's keto and intermittent fasting are a way of encouraging lipolysis. So that's how I did it.
And gentle exercise.
Sorry?
And gentle exercise.
Yeah, so I didn't do any exercise other than golf, maybe once a fortnight, and even then I drove a cart. So I'm the laziest dieter in the world. I have started exercising over the last 6 weeks because I ended up, so I've actually put 2 kilos back on, but of muscle, because I ended up looking like a cyclist. Sorry, no disrespect to cyclists, but I had no shoulders and a massive head. And a friend of mine who's a bodybuilder, he said, "You look like a cyclist." And I looked at a picture of me, and I did. I got tiny shoulders and this big head. So I started to bulk up on the shoulders a little bit. So I'm doing a bit more exercise, but I'm only doing resistance training. So I'm doing squats and push-ups and planks and pull-ups and a bit of barbell work.
How do you maintain a motivation? It's a hell of a...
I'm not motivated. No. It's a habit now. It's just what. Motivation is the motivation monkey. We're going to talk about behavioural change. The motivation monkey gets us all in the end. We have to build it into a habit where it's automatic, where it's just ritual. So every Monday and Thursday, I ritually fast. So I still fast, not as seriously as I used to fast. But even on a fast day, I would have 4 boiled eggs and 2 gin sodas. And I would save my calories. I don't count calories anymore. No, I'm not an alcoholic, honestly. But it was. So I'm going through this. So for me, it was when I do this, I'm going to do this. So on a fast day, when I don't eat and punish myself and get hungry. I mean, when's the last time you felt hungry? It's very rare these days we feel hungry. I actually feel hungry, and it's like, actually, as a reward for my hunger, I'm going to have a gin and soda. But it was still in the day, I was only having 600 calories.
You said that you don't want anybody to feel stressed. I mean, doesn't fasting, when you started it, doesn't that cause stress? So you've got to get, as I said, the call on the family and start. You'd think. Just because it's just.
So the best protocol for getting into fasting is to become fat adapted first. So if you're a carbohydrate dependent person, so 50% of your diet is still sugar, you can't just jump into intermittent fasting, because that's like trying to run the barbecue on rolled up newspaper. It's like, there's no newspaper. And it's like, yes, stress, both from a physiological point of view and from a mental point of view. So you must become fat adapted, keto adapted, so increase protein, increase fat, reduce carbohydrates, and over a period of time, maybe depending on how dependent on sugar you are, it can take 4 to 6 weeks to get to a point where you're comfortable in that long term. In the meantime, what you can do is you can start doing a 16-8 time restricted eating. So you eat within an 8-hour window, and then you don't eat for the other 16 hours. And that encourages the body to like, well, so I'm still going to eat between 8 o'clock in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, or 12 o'clock in the afternoon and 8 o'clock at night, depending on, everybody's different. So there's some people like eating breakfast first thing because they're hungry. When you get into the fasting, what happens is your body releases glucose into the system, so you naturally wake up not really hungry because you're basically using the fat stored. And so you can go till like 10 or 11, 12 o'clock before you actually think, I could eat something. Like today I broke fast at 12 o'clock and I had a crab salad and a crab avocado and lumpfish caviar. And yesterday I did the same thing. Yesterday I fasted on Thursday, so I fasted Thursday, which was yesterday, and so I didn't actually break my fast until lunchtime today. So I hadn't had anything to eat properly since Wednesday night. But on Wednesday I only had 2 meals. I had lunch and dinner.
Did you drink lots of water still?
Yeah, so I do drink water, but I found that I don't drink as much water as I used to drink when I used to eat carbohydrates. So that thing about, drinking 2 litres of water or 8 glasses or whatever it might be, it changes when your diet changes. When you diet, because what happens with carbohydrates is it stores water. When you do Atkins or when you start keto, the first thing you notice is your body goes, I'm burning the sugar now that's stored in glycogen, and it releases the water and flushes the kidneys and takes the salt with it. So that's one of the things that people talk about is keto flu, and that's basically electrolyte imbalance. So you need to replace those electrolytes that have been flushed from the kidneys where they've been stored. So yeah, you have to adapt gradually.
What about coffee? That breakfast thing, a friend of mine did, he had coffee in the morning and wouldn't have anything till 12, then he'd eat from 12 to 8,
yeah. And
then same thing, had coffee in the morning.
Yeah, so I do the same thing. Black coffee doesn't break the fast.
Is it milk that does?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because milk's got lactose in it, which is a sugar. Galactose is a sugar. So if you put, some of you might have heard of bulletproof coffee, which is basically whizzing up grass-fed butter and MCT oil with your coffee and a Ninja Blitz in it. It's like the heaviest, creamiest latte you've ever drank in your life. I can't.
You can buy it at the cafe near the
Caribou. The Caribou?
Yeah.
Yeah.
King Edward?
Yeah. So coffee, I still drink coffee. I have a triple shot espresso, and an hour later a double shot espresso, and then I don't. And then no more. So I don't drink coffee after 7:30 a.m. So I get up at 5:30 and have a triple shot, wake up, take the dog for a walk, come back, have another double shot. That's me done. So again, genetic variations. As we get older, we actually find it harder to metabolize toxins like coffee. So when you're younger, you can probably drink more coffee and still be drinking it at lunchtime. As you get older, or if you've got a genetic polymorphism so some people for some people the half-life of coffee is 12 hours, and for some people it's 6 hours. So some people where it's 6 hours, they can have a coffee at lunchtime and it not affect their sleep. If it's half-life 12 hours, they have to have it like first thing in the morning, otherwise they can't get to sleep at night. Yeah. So I still drink coffee.
And how sensitive are you to if you just have a binge day for whatever reason?
So the aim of the game.
One binge day, that's it, throws it all back, and you've got to go again?
Well, so that's the motivation monkey that we were talking about. That's the problem with using motivation as your anchor. If it's a ritual and you fall off the wagon, you get back on the horse without thinking. So if it becomes part of who you are as your identity, when I do this, I'm going to do this, then you don't, when you crash and burn, you wake up the next morning and you go, right, okay, I'm going to go back to the habits, because they're habits, not motivation. So if you fall off the wagon while you're building the habits, it's harder. But yeah, then it's not about the motivation or the commitment once you've cemented the habits. So that's the thing we do with coaching. The coaching is to cement the habits, not the nutritional information per se, although that's obviously part of it.
Do you find with intermittent fasting, drinking coffee as well, and you're trying to avoid anxiety, it actually makes me anxious. If I haven't eaten something in the morning, I get
Yeah, but I don't think, it's not the coffee necessarily that's making you anxious, it's the fact that you've maybe not got any glucose in your body, so you're under stress. So that's why you're feeling anxious, because you've got that kind of stress response. So it's the cortisol. So anxiety comes from the amygdala, comes from the cortisol. The coffee can accelerate that. So if you don't want to feel anxious, or if you're feeling anxious, don't have a coffee, because that is going to make it worse. It's like an accelerant. But you said something about intermittent fasting.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, if I don't eat.
If you don't eat.
Yeah, then I'll feel more anxious.
You know, once you've keto adapted, then you don't feel as hungry when you wake up. So if you're relying on fueling the barbecue with Tinder and newspapers, you wake up and you feel hungry. Whereas if you're keto adapted and you say for every 4 kilos of fat that you carry, you're carrying 38,000 calories of stored energy. Okay. If you've burnt through the glycogen, which is only 3,000 calories, your body needs to access that stored energy. If you're not in that fat burning metabolism, then your body's in and it's stressed, then you're not accessing the stored energy, then you're going to be hungry. That's when you're going to crave it. So that's why we talk about becoming fat adapted before the intermittent fasting, so that your body is running on a much slower burning fuel. It's like burning charcoal rather than newspaper.
So according to your philosophy, beans are good for you or not?
No. Beans are legumes. So legumes are the seed of a plant, so they carry toxins. In fact, ricin is made from the bean of the castor bean. So one of the most deadly toxins that's been formulated by man in the last 100 years is made from beans, from castor beans. There was Georgy, some Russian guy was hit with an umbrella in the 1970s, and it was a tiny, tiny molecule of ricin, and it literally travelled up into his system and killed him. That comes from beans. So that's a lectin. So they contain lectins. Beans. So that's why we boil kidney beans. We can't eat them raw. It's why we soak and sprout and ferment and all of those kind of processes. So also beans can be quite high in xenoestrogens. So if you want to increase the amount of estrogen in your body, eat more xenoestrogens. Xenoestrogen binds to your estrogen receptors in the same way that estrogen does. So your body thinks it's got lots of estrogen. If you're a guy, you don't want lots of estrogen in your body. So if you're a guy, ditch the soy milk, ditch the soybeans, don't eat the tofu. Unless you want boobs.
Chickpeas are the same as beans?
Chickpeas are legumes. Look, in small amounts. In small amounts, but if your diet is like I'm having hummus every day and I'm having lentils every day, and who doesn't? You can have bits. Yeah, sorry. You can have hummus. Obviously, you can eat anything you like. It's just knowing what's pro-inflammatory and what's anti-inflammatory and what it's doing to your body. So alcohol's a poison. I still drink. It's just picking the poison that you want and dealing with it.
What would you put on a frying pan? So,
fry?
Yeah.
How hot am I frying? What am I frying?
Bacon and cheese.
So bacon, I wouldn't use any fat. I'd use a cold pan and I'd have it on a low heat and let the fat render out, and it'll crisp up in its own fat. Okay. And what was the other one?
Just sausages.
Sausages. I would use either coconut oil, refined coconut oil, so it's not got a coconutty flavour, or lard. Lard's great with pork sausages. Tallow's great with beef sausages. Butter's got a problem because it'll burn at a certain temperature, but put a splash of olive oil in with the butter and it stops the butter burning. Olive oil you don't want to heat at a high heat, but olive oil's fine. Avocado oil's better. A lot more expensive.
Virgin, like you've got virgin, extra virgin, cold.
Always use,
all of that.
you always use extra virgin. Yeah. It's the purest form of the oil. Everything else is cut. And be really careful where you get it from. Don't get Coles own brand, because a lot of olive oils are cut with seed oils, and they don't have to say so on the label. So tallow. Ghee is a clarified butter where they remove the milk solids out of it. That's really good for frying. And at high temperature, coconut oil, tallow, lard, avocado oil. Those kind of ones that are high in saturated fats. The thing about saturated fat is if the fat or oil is high in saturated fat, it's more stable. So that's why, because olive oil is high in monounsaturated fat, so it's less stable. So it can degrade through heat if it's heated beyond its point. It's basically there's a weak point in its molecular chain. Interesting, there's as much saturated fat in a tablespoonful of olive oil as there is in a pork chop. So the fat in meat is generally 50-50, saturated fat and monounsaturated fat. So when we think about eating pork chops and we see the fat, we think it's saturated fat, high in cholesterol, but it's not, it's 50-50, whereas olive oil is 60-40, monounsaturated, saturated. So if you're eating a lean pork chop, you could be eating less saturated fat than you would be if you were having a tablespoon of olive oil. The other thing to remember with oils is they're quite calorific, so there's a lot of energy in there. So for every 100 grams or 100 millilitres of fat, you're having about 800 calories. So a handful of macadamia nuts could be 800 calories. So just, there's a lot of energy in fat, which is why you can live off this stuff. Got one more slide. So, just so you know, this is what Gene Life does: individual coaching, group programs, health workshops, corporate wellness, and we do. And what we're trying to do is to help people accelerate weight loss, increase energy, improve stress sleep, develop stamina strength, slow down aging, and lower the risk of chronic metabolic diseases. Any questions after this, go to the website or email me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I get a picture?
Yeah, sure.
No, don't hide the lollies. No, I'll do a selfie. I'll have to do it that way. That's better. I'll come to this corner over here. There, right. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thanks very much.